The release of the Resident Evil 3 remake on April 3, 2020, successfully, if contentiously, redefined the characters of Jill Valentine and the titular Nemesis, as well as the story events of the game upon which it was based. While this release was oddly timely, that it deals with a viral outbreak and was released at the beginning of the global pandemic was disconcertingly coincidental in its timing, it also restructured both Jill's presentation and the dynamic between her and the Nemesis monster. Because of these rather sweeping changes, now is a good time to look back and examine how the original 1999 game treated these characters, the relationship to one another, and the ways in which it both reinforced and defied patriarchal expectations for video games of the time. By 1999, the release and success of both the original Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 had three major consequences which would impact the development of the next entry in the franchise. First, with the new franchise's success, imitators became plentiful. Even Capcom themselves would create a copycat-style game in the form of Dino Crisis. The two series were closely tied to one another though. Dino Crisis was sold with a demo for Resident Evil 3, and one of the unlockable alternate costumes for the main protagonist in Resident Evil 3 was the character model for Regina, the main protagonist from Dino Crisis. Part of the reason for this close linkage between Dino Crisis and Resident Evil 3 is that the actual minute-to-minute gameplay mechanics are remarkably similar, which belies the other consequence of the Resident Evil franchise's success. While, in name, there were only 2 entries in the series prior to Resident Evil 3's release by 1999, there were actually 5 entries in the series in total. Each of these iterations featured minor changes, but the fact is that these changes were small enough that, by that point, the Resident Evil gameplay formula had become not only familiar, but also slightly stale. The dual issues of imitation and series staleness were highlighted by the release in 1999, just prior to Resident Evil 3, of Silent Hill for the Sony PlayStation. In their previews for the game in late 1998, early 1999, official US PlayStation Magazine, GamePro, and Electronic Gaming Monthly all refer to Resident Evil in their descriptions, talking about how similar Silent Hill's design is to the Resident Evil games. Upon release, however, the comparisons to the Resident Evil series, while not entirely disappearing, started painting Resident Evil as the shallower of the two games or series. The main reason for this shift in opinion is the nature of the fear elicited in the two experiences. Resident Evil offers the pressure of being alone against seemingly overwhelming odds, combined with a healthy dose of jump scares. Silent Hill elicits a more deliberately paced psychological horror, even as it relies more on the supernatural. For example, Joe Rybicki, in official US PlayStation Magazine's review of the game, argued that, where one might compare Resident Evil with movies like Night of the Living Dead, I would compare Silent Hill with more genuinely disturbing films like The Exorcist, The Shining, Kubrick's of course, and perhaps even Psycho. The response to Silent Hill would be further complicated by the third consequence of the Resident Evil series' success. By 1999, multiple entries in the franchise were in development at Capcom. Resident Evil 0 for the Nintendo 64, a prequel to the first game in the series, Resident Evil 3 for the Sega Dreamcast, and Resident Evil Gaiden, or Side Story, a less linear city escape experience bookending the events of Resident Evil 2 for the Sony PlayStation. As documented by IGN though, Sony had a deal with Capcom for Resident Evil 3 to appear exclusively on the PlayStation. As a result of this exclusivity deal, the side story being worked on for the PlayStation became what would be known as Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, with the original character who was supposed to be the player avatar changed into Jill Valentine, and the originally intended Resident Evil 3 turned into Resident Evil Code Veronica. This could explain why Jill, an experienced special tactics operative, would be running around a zombie apocalypse in such an impractical outfit. She was not supposed to be Jill at all. While not directly stated, it does appear that the shift from an original character to Jill was done quickly. There is a problem with this explanation though. Jill's outfit from the original game is an unlockable bonus item in Resident Evil 3, which means that even if it were included late in the game's development, Jill could easily have been dressed for facing zombie hordes rather than a night of clubbing. It is clear that Jill's impractical outfit was a deliberate choice on the part of the game's developers. The impracticality of Jill's outfit provides an overt catering to the male gaze absent in the female playable characters in previous games. As much as she is the player character and has more actions and agency than any previous player character, she is still presented as the object critiqued by John Berger and Peggy Awesh. This shift makes the question of why Jill is presented in such a sexualized manner even more puzzling, a puzzle whose potential answer lies not with Jill, but with her nemesis. Examining the Nemesis, it is important to look at the context of the in-game dynamics in which he is presented. Because of the lack of new enemy encounters on offer, the Nemesis winds up doing a lot of the heavy lifting, as it were, in making the game a unique experience. As a result of this pressure to perform, the Nemesis winds up becoming a dominating force throughout the game, chasing Jill and the player at various points across the city. When Nemesis appears, it can follow Jill and the player through multiple rooms, a chase that is dictated by gameplay systems rather than as a pre-scripted event, and something that would be changed in the 2020 remake of the game. This dynamic, in terms of both gameplay and between characters, invites comparisons to the killers in the slasher films discussed by Carol J. Clover in her foundational article and chapter, Her Body Himself. In many respects, the Nemesis, despite being a literal monster, shares many parallels with the filmic killers Clover examines, most closely Halloween's Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees of the Friday the 13th series. As Clover states about the typical slasher movie killer, they are usually large, sometimes overweight, and often masked. In short, they may be recognizably human, but they are only marginally so, just as they are only marginally visible to their victims and to us, the spectators. In one key respect, however, the killers are superhuman, their virtual indestructibility. Just as Michael, in Halloween, repeatedly rises from blows that would stop a lesser man, so Jason, in the Friday the 13th films, survives assault after assault to return in sequel after sequel. Many of these traits are in evidence in the Nemesis behavior. The Nemesis appears out of nowhere, announced only by a roar and a growl of stars. It can also take damage that would handily destroy any of the other enemies in the game. The Nemesis additionally shares physical traits with Clover's description. It is large and recognizably human, or humanoid at any rate, and the flesh pulled across its face, while not a mask in and of itself, is mask-like enough to give the dichotomous dehumanizing effect Clover mentions, heightened in the remake with the addition of a deformed nose to the monster's face. While the Nemesis does not return for any sequels, it can be argued that the Nemesis is already a sequel return of sorts. As detailed in the Resident Evil archives, the Nemesis is a variation on the Tyrant monster which has appeared in each prior game. As such, Nemesis conforms even more closely to Clover's configuration, with one key change. Rather than simply being a spectator, the audience member is actively confronting the killer from sequel to sequel. Not only does this active repetitive confrontation carry more investment for players familiar with prior games, but it also suggests thematic ties to those prior games. There is an important distinction to be made between the Nemesis and Clover's conception of the slasher killer. While Clover acknowledges the phallic nature of the slasher's typical penetrating weapon, be it machete, drill, knife, or so on, she also argues that these tools highlight a non-phallic or feminine sexuality to the killer. She points out that the killers who are not stuck within a pre-adolescent mental framework or in the throes of gender confusion are, as she puts it, sexually disturbed. In this framework, violence is not tied to sex, but is a replacement for it, often because the killer is impotent, either physically or due to psychological factors. The issue with the Nemesis then is that, while the Nemesis' main weapon, the throbbing purple hand tentacle, most certainly aligns with the phallic nature of the slasher's tools, it is not an extra physical replacement for a phallus. Instead, it is the bioorganic weapon, or BOW, equivalent of a phallus or phallic body part. This alignment of the tentacle with a phallus is not just a psychoanalytical conceit, but a cultural one as well. As Susan Napier discusses in her chapter on hentai in her book on anime, most of the phalluses in these films are offered in the form of what she dubs the demonic phallus incarnate. She further elaborates by pointing out that in Japan, until fairly recently, as of 2001, it was forbidden to show male genitalia in comics, animation, film, or photography. It was still presumably easier to get away with showing non-human genitalia in the form of demonic phalluses or phallus-like tentacles. Yet, despite this tentacle being a literal body part, it is no less impotent. As evidenced in this scene, the Nemesis has no difficulty with getting this body part to function, but at the same time, there is no way for it to achieve any sort of orgasm or ejaculation.
Jill, help!
Again, Napier's examination of hentai proves instructive here. In talking about the male body in hentai, she states, In general, male orgasm is depicted far less frequently than male frustration or simply endless penetration, no doubt due in part to censorship limitations and also because orgasm might suggest a vulnerable loss of control. The sexual male's combination of frustration and desperate need for control underlines once again the paucity of sexual identities available to the Japanese male. Because the Nemesis is an embodied tool of control, created by Umbrella specifically to eliminate STARS members under cover of the T-virus outbreak, this frustration underlines the key similarity to Clover's model. The Nemesis offers a depiction of impotent masculinity that is so fragile that the only way to express it is through horrific and ever-escalating violence. With the Nemesis conforming so closely to Clover's conception of the killer in slasher movies, it would make sense for Jill to conform to Clover's most famous concept, the final girl. This is not the case, however. Certainly, Jill shares some of the traits Clover attributes to the final girl character. She is clearly intelligent. She would have to be in order to survive not one, but two large-scale encounters with zombies and other bioengineered weapons. She carries herself with gravity. It's a little hard not to be grave in the face of a zombie apocalypse. And finally, she is mechanically and practically competent, not only needing to solve the puzzles spread throughout the city, but also mixing her own ammunition, along with the fact that she remains the master of unlocking. In one major aspect though, Jill differs significantly. Clover describes the final girl as being boyish, and characterized by her lack of sexuality and her unfemininity. The main criticism leveled at Jill actually illustrates this discord with Clover's final girl model. Jill's outfit, rather than being bookwormish, as Clover argues, is overtly sexualized. Not only that, but there is no sudden turnaround in the confrontations between Jill and the Nemesis. Jill does not suddenly masculinize herself in a final confrontation with the Nemesis using a phallic weapon, as Clover articulates. Instead, Jill, and therefore the player, has the option of facing the Nemesis head-on in each encounter from the outset. Paul Wells, in his overview of the cinematic horror genre, posits a critique of Clover and counter-interpretation of the final girl, which may further assist in positioning Jill. He states that Clover's definition of the final girl as a phallic heroine is questionable. These are not quasi-men, literally castrating male figures. They often distinguish themselves by not merely rejecting the established tenets of masculine behavior, but enhance their credentials as modern post-feminist women by moving beyond both the traditional and generic expectations of women and feminist and psychoanalytic orientations. The idea that the rejection of traditional feminine values inherently meaning an adoption of masculine ones being a fallacy is an important distinction to make. Clover, in taking that stance, assumes a gender binary dynamic, even as she argues that she does not. Wells points out that not adhering to traditional feminine mores does not automatically mean that one then adheres to masculine ones. Viewed in the context of her confrontations with the Nemesis, Jill's outfit takes on connotations of someone comfortable with their sexuality. Moreover, Jill's appearance and ability to confront the Nemesis in each encounter offers a contrast and conflict between her confident female sexuality and the Nemesis' embodiment of impotent and, by extension, fragile masculinity. This conflict is emphasized by the Nemesis' multiple transformations after various defeats. After Jill defeats the Nemesis in the courtyard outside the clock tower, it discards its coat and develops several new tentacles. Both changes, the bare chest and the additional phallus-like appendages, carry an air of masculine posturing in the face of repeated losses to Jill. To be sure, this does not lessen the issue surrounding Jill's presentation in the male gaze. Much like Helen W. Kennedy recognized the problematic valorization of Lara Croft as a feminist character given her overt catering to the male gaze, such a recognition must be made here. Jill's presentation, both in terms of visual representation and as a set of embodied gameplay skills, offers a similar dichotomous position, one for which there is no easy answer. Given this dynamic of confident female sexuality and fragile masculinity in the Jill-Nemesis relationship, a comparison can and must be made to Silent Hill. As mentioned before, Silent Hill offered a challenge to Resident Evil's dominance of the horror genre in video games. In addressing this challenge, there is a distinct positionality taken by each game. In this regard, Clover's discussion of the movies Silent Hill was compared to in contemporary reviews is useful. Moreover, Barbara Creed also directly addresses one of Silent Hill's key inspirations, illustrating how Silent Hill and Resident Evil 3 offers oppositional stances on gender. The most obvious split between the two games is in terms of the player character. In Resident Evil 3, the player controls Jill, a highly trained special operations officer. Silent Hill puts players in control of Harry Mason, an ordinary man with no special training or skills. Aside from the difference in weapon handling for the player, there is the fact that Silent Hill offers only a male perspective. This dichotomy extends to the antagonistic forces in the respective games as well. Where Resident Evil 3 casts the monster as a hulking brute hell-bent on the player's destruction, the source of the monsters in Silent Hill is Harry's own daughter, Cheryl, who is revealed to be a manifestation of Alessa, a girl possessed by a demon and held captive by a cult. That the antagonist in Silent Hill is a girl on the cusp of adolescence is an important factor in examining the gender dynamics of the game and the way the two games contrast with each other. It is telling that Joe Rybicki compared Silent Hill to The Exorcist in his review of the game, because that film, as Clover and Creed both demonstrate, centers on gender dynamics. Clover points out that possession films like The Exorcist are stories about female bodies either just entering adolescence or just entering adulthood proper. Despite this focus on the female body, Clover argues that these films are ineffably stories about the men who confront these possessions and their character arcs. For example, in The Exorcist, the film focuses on Father Karras' crisis of faith and how it is affected and changed due to the experience of dealing with Regan's possession. In this regard, Silent Hill goes a step further. Not only is the story focused on the male protagonist, and not only is Harry's the only perspective the player experiences, but he is the only entryway into the game itself. Cheryl does not even really appear beyond the opening cutscene until the very end of the game, and it is revealed that Alessa, and therefore Cheryl, is confined to a hospital bed the entire time. Mason is literally the driving force of the story, in that he is the one who keeps it moving both narratively as well as physically. It is his movement through the space of the town, and his uncovering of the mysteries within that progress the game. Further to this, it is not a coincidence that Cheryl and Alessa are both at the age where they would be entering puberty. Both Clover and Creed comment on this in their examinations of The Exorcist. Clover compares the nature of the possession in The Exorcist to the manifestation of supernatural powers in Carrie and the Fury, all ostensibly coming-of-age puberty stories. Creed also states that it is clearly significant that Regan is possessed in her 13th year, which marks the commencement of puberty, the threshold between girlhood and womanhood, the time when adolescent sexual desires find shape and expression. Clover takes it further and suggests that it is not just female puberty which is made monstrous, but female bodily sexuality as a whole. This is the crux of Silent Hill's difference from Resident Evil 3. If, in Resident Evil 3, the player takes the role of confident female sexuality fighting against an impotent and ragingly fragile masculinity, then Silent Hill tasks the player with confronting and defeating female puberty. In the best ending for Silent Hill, Harry manages to rescue both children, along with Sybil Bennett, a police officer from a neighboring town who also winds up possessed. The most noteworthy part of this ending is that Alessa remanifests as a newborn. Harry and the player literally defeat her pubescent form, causing her to revert to infancy. Thus, while Resident Evil may have been the more played out series at that point, it arguably had the more progressive gender politics compared to the new contender to the throne in Silent Hill.